Hey y'all, welcome to Brianna Approved, a podcast for people who like a holistic approach to real science and clinical research on all things nutrition, botanicals, and balance. I'm your host, Brianna Diorio, clinical nutritionist, herbal practitioner, and recovering super spaz.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Brianna Approved podcast. We are on episode 4, and I am very excited for this episode because I think this topic is something that we can all use a little bit more information about right now. We're going to be talking about Psychoneuroimmunology, and that sounds like a really complicated word, but we're going to break it down. We are going to, of course, do our fun fact for the day. We're going to get into the history of what psychoneuroimmunology is and what that means, how our brain actually has its own immune system, the connection between inflammation and our mood, something called sickness behavior, why you feel like a little bitch sometimes when you don't feel well. And then we're going to touch a little bit on why not all stress is created equal, and of course a new segment at the end called Knowledge Bites, because knowledge is your brain's favorite food. So we'll talk about emotional immunity. So let's get into the show. Your fun fact for the day while I sip cafe. Did you know that the European Journal of Cancer found that psychosocial influences such as social support, loneliness, and work environment can influence immune function? What's also interesting is that these other psychological factors, so your mental and emotional state, your attitude, your beliefs, can influence not only the progression of immune function, but also the development of certain health conditions. So this might sound a little hippy-dippy to people, but this is what we're going to be talking about today. Basically, how your brain communicates with your immune system. So the thoughts that we think, the things that we say to ourselves, how we perceive a stressful situation, and we're going to get into kind of the nervous system, which is broken down into two main branches. We have, our sympathetic and our parasympathetic, so that fight or flight response, or that, rest and digest, and how our body's immune system and our hormones, aka your endocrine system, can all be influenced by this. Now, I like to say this is kind of like when you're a kid and you have maybe like a secret language with one of your cousins, and only the both of you understand what you guys are saying to each other, and outsiders looking in don't really understand what's going on. Or if you have a sibling, you kind of know that as you get older, you have this unspoken language with each other where you can look at each other a certain way and know what the other person is thinking. Like, we have to get out of this party right now. And that is what psychoneuroimmunology is. It's this communication between our brain and our endocrine system and our immune system, and basically how they're always chatting with each other in their own little language. Before we get into what psychoneuroimmunology is, I want to get into the history a little bit because I think it's pretty interesting. So many of you may have heard of the Russian psychologist Pavlov. He's pretty much known for conditioning dogs to salivate when they heard the ringing of the bell by basically ringing a bell when they were given food. And what would happen is they came to automatically associate the sound of the bell with the act of eating, so that when food was no longer given, the sound of the bell would automatically cause them to salivate. Now, this is where psychoneuroimmunology actually started to develop in the classical conditioning model. So these Russian researchers were conducting these different series of experiments that showed the body's other systems may also be altered by conditioning through things like, thoughts and beliefs. And this is why I'm so big on pro-inflammatory people and pro-inflammatory foods, and why this can also play a role in what's going on in your overall health. Now, there was an American researcher named Robert Ader, He's considered to be the father of modern psychoneuroimmunology, or PNI, as you might hear me say throughout this episode. He did a lot of research that looked at rats, basically, and the communication between the brain and the immune system. But what these other American researchers did is that they looked at certain immune responses and how they could be enhanced or suppressed through a wide variety of conditioned cues. So this is where things like placebo and nocebo can come into play, where you think you're taking something and you feel better, or if you don't think you're taking something and maybe you feel the same. So placebo and nocebo can kind of work different ways. I'll probably do an entire episode on that at some later point. But basically in 1981, there was a neuroscientist named David Felton, and he basically found out that there was this entire network of nerves that led to blood vessels and cells of the immune system. So he discovered this whole network of things that impacted what was going on in the immune system. And the rest of his team found that there were these nerves in our thymus gland, which is a part of the lymphatic system, aka your immune system, and the spleen. Now, anybody who has been following me long enough knows that the spleen is my absolute favorite organ, because in Chinese medicine, we know that the spleen deals with worry and pensiveness and emotions. And yes, in some part it deals with digestion, but it also deals with immunity. So a lot of the times you'll hear me say to people, how are you digesting life? If there are spleen imbalances in your body, you might not only be having GI issues, you might also be going through some emotional issues as well, especially if you are that type A, worrier, pensive kind of thinker. They actually found these nerves in the spleen and the thymus, and they were also found in, macrophages and mast cells. So basically all of these other parts of our immune system. Fast forward to 1985, Candace Pert found neurotransmitters and neuropeptide receptors on the cell walls of the immune system and the brain. So there are literally these receptors, these like docking sites. Think about if you ever played musical chairs, right? And you got to go and get to the chair first. So we have all these little chairs in not only our immune system, but in our brain that literally interact with neurotransmitters and neuropeptides. And this showed us that these communication chemicals, because that's what neurotransmitters are, that's what they do, they talk to each other, they can also talk to the immune system. So this was a wildly amazing to discover, because we're now understanding how the mind can truly impact our health on a lot of different levels. Now, you can look at some examples of how psychology actually shows this impact on the immune system. You may have heard of something like broken heart syndrome, or you've heard, I'm sure, of stories where there was a couple who was together for 50 years and then one of the people died, and then a couple weeks later, the other person died. So bereavement, there was actually a study that looked at 95,000 recently widowed individuals, and they found that during the first week after bereavement, mortality was twice the expected rate. So, that feeling when you want to literally die from a broken heart, we'll talk about how there's actually this interaction. I think something that maybe resonates with people a little bit more is the gut. We know that there's a really strong association and connection between when you have a stressful event going on in your life and then the immediate onset of GI issues. Maybe you get a really nervous stomach. Maybe you have to go to the bathroom right away. Nervous diarrhea is a thing that people get. So, there's definitely a connection that you've experienced in your life, butterflies in your tummy, right? All of this. And of course, the vagus nerve plays a role in that, but the psychoneuroimmunological effect is really what we're going to focus on today. For the next segment of our show, we're going to get into Nerd Alert. Nerd Alert. Nerd Alert. Psychoneuroimmunology, or basically how the mind affects your health. So psychoneuroimmunology is basically the study of this interaction between the mind, the nervous system, and the immune system. It's this bidirectional neurological pathway that exists. And we know that there's even implications in psychological stress and depression that can impact the immune system. Before we get any further, we want to actually break down this word and what it actually means. So PNI, Psychoneuroimmunology. So psychological. This is anything that is affecting the mind. It relates to our mental state, our emotional state, right? What's going on with our psyche? So that's the P in psychoneuroimmunology. Then we move to the neuroscience. So this is the scientific study of the nervous system, how the nervous system and how the brain works. The nervous system for some people can get tricky because the nervous system has some people will say 3 parts if you talk about the enteric nervous system or the gut-brain axis, but the central nervous system is basically made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of all of the nerves that branch off from the spinal cord and extend throughout the body. So this is why when we have a thought or a feeling, whether it's currently happening now or we think about something that happened in the past, you can immediately feel stressed out. If I think about trying to call and connect to United Customer Service, my shoulders start to tense up. I can feel my blood boiling. I can maybe start to feel sweat collecting on my lower back, right? Because my psychological event that's happening is directly affecting the neuroscience of my body, the nervous system. And then the I in psychoneuroimmunology, immunology. This is the branch of medicine and biology that is concerned with immunity. So this is a really big conversation because you'll hear me talk about this, but your immune system is kind of just always secondarily responding to what's going on in your central nervous system, your brain, your spinal cord, so on and so forth. And what's interesting is that this starts very young. The brain and the immune system are not fully formed at birth, and they continue to mature in response to postnatal environment. And what this means is that early life stress can predict on some level inflammation or diseases that you may develop later on in life as an adult, because this two-way interaction between the brain and the immune system makes these psychosocial stressors impact how our immune system develops, how the brain develops, and some of its long-term functioning. The good news is, if you had any sort of trauma at a young age, there are things that you can do to, rewire the brain. Neuroplasticity is an amazing topic. We can definitely talk about that at a later time, but it's important to remember that the nervous system is in charge. So there's a lot of this research, again, that's linking the immune system and the brain to things like, illness and stress and mood. Think about when you are sick. Are you in a great mood? Probably not, right? So there's definitely a two-way communication. Also think about when you're in a bad mood. Do you feel like doing anything super fun and exciting? Do you feel like going and, running a mile? Maybe for some people because it can release endorphins, but sometimes when you feel depressed, we actually have depressive symptoms in the body physiologically. Things can slow down, right? Heart rate, things like that. So when the activated immune system generates some of these chemical signals, we have these things called cytokines. They're perceived by the immune system. And again, this bidirectional communication, think back to my analogy of having a sibling, they're always chit-chatting with each other and always looking for outside cues. And we want to remember that almost everybody has experienced a stressful period in their life, right? You've ever been, quote, sick to your stomach? Now think back to when it was super stressful. Maybe you were planning a wedding, you were taking a big exam, maybe somebody in your family passed away. What we know is that when stress happens, the immune system immediately will turn on in these short-term crisis modes. and it can kind of diminish as the persistent stress stays. So we want to make sure that we have balance with it. We don't want to totally avoid, stress and these feelings, but we do know that changes over time in mood and cognition from day to day are driven by events that occur in the immune system, particularly from some of these inflammation chemicals, some of these cytokines. As I said before, the immune system is always secondarily responding to you and to your central nervous system and what you have going on. Think back to when you were a kid in elementary school and you had a fire alarm. Whether the fire alarm was real or fake, you had to have the same protocol that happened. Everybody had to get up and stay in single file lines, so on and so forth. Now, sometimes you knew that the fire alarm was going to happen. Your teacher would say, hey, third period, we're going to have a fire alarm, and then we'll get back to class. This is what happens in the body as well. Whether we're having a real stress, a perceived stress, mental stuff that we're making up, negative things we're saying to ourselves, our body's having that fire alarm effect where you have to respond accordingly. So your brain is in charge, right? Your brain is the teacher saying you're going to have a fire alarm. And the immune system is us either going to freak out knowing that it's not a drill, or we're going to be calm because we're like, listen, this is a fake fire and we're going to be okay. This is when we have opportunities to say, I'm going through a really stressful event right now. It's not going to last forever. I'm going to be okay. Because the immune system is a sensory organ and it's sending signals about different pathogens and thoughts and chemicals, just as the eyes send visual signals and the ears send auditory signals back to the brain. So the brain responds and produces these hormones and these neurochemicals that can directly alter immune function. So this is why that Pavlovian conditioning can suppress or enhance immune response, and these stressful life experiences and emotional states, like maybe being depressed, like maybe being anxious, can generally be immunosuppressive in nature. Why after you have a very, very stressful event in your life, good or bad, eustress or distress, planning a wedding or planning a funeral, you might notice that after it's over, you get really sick. You get totally wiped out. Again, because this can build up over time and definitely play a role in the disease process. We know that the immune-brain connection is very real. And when I talk about the immune-brain connection, I'm talking more so about non-specific immune response. We talked a little bit about this in a previous episode, but our non-specific immune response is that body's rapid first-line defense against infection and injury that happens basically an hour or two after infection. And this non-specific immune response is triggering a whole host of behavioral changes and physiological changes. So maybe you get a fever, maybe you don't want to eat anything, maybe you get really tired, maybe you also have some of these classic stress responses like an increase in cortisol, right? And this is where things like sickness behavior can come into play. So again, when you've been in a really bad mood, you might notice that you feel really tired, or after you had an interaction with a super toxic person, you might feel emotionally drained. You aren't really super motivated or excited to do much of anything. And so sickness behavior is involved in these functional changes in not only our mood, but also memory, cognition, sleep, and it can activate the HPA stress response. So when you are sick, it's actually your immune system that's telling your brain that you should lie down and take it easy because it's sending these signals, interleukin 1, interleukin 6, these other cytokines that have a profound effect on the brain, which can cause sickness behavior. So whether you want to respond or not has a lot to do with the strength of the signal and your willingness to listen. So some people who are strong-minded, right? They don't listen to their body's response. they will eventually at some point have to listen later, and biology generally wins. You'll get really tired, you'll get more rundown, you'll get more sick. So it's really important to listen when your body's having that fire drill to what's going on. What's also very cool is that your brain has its own immune system. I like to say that our brain is kind of like the manager of the body, and our immune system is like the talent, right? So our brain and our central nervous system are separated from the body's immune system basically by the blood-brain barrier. However, the brain's immune system is called the neuro immune system. And so the brain being the body's command center, and the immune system basically is just listening to what's going on. There's a quote that Kanye West has that he says, "I can't be managed." And that's what happens sometimes when our immune system doesn't listen to our brain, or when we start to go down a really negative path, or we start to have negative thoughts or say things like, "I'm going to always be sick," or "I feel like crap." Say that right now to yourself. If you actually stop for a second and say, "I feel like crap," you might notice your shoulders start to sink down, maybe your eyes get droopy. But when we say positive things like, "I feel healthy, I feel great," then we can actually notice our shoulders perking up. Maybe our eyes dilate a little bit. Again, because the brain is the body's command center, and the immune system sometimes listens and it sometimes does not. So unlike other organs, our immune system can kind of roam freely throughout the blood and into other tissues. And again, it's just always responding independently while, the brain kind of has to, chill out and take in all these interceptions and kind of have this bigger picture mode of saying, well, what's going on? What do I need to react to? I have 1,000 fires that I'm trying to put out. What's most important? And so the microglia, which is the brain's immune cells, are involved in everything from brain development to protecting us against diseases in the long term. So this is where psychoneuroimmunology can become very important again, because the immune system sends these signals to the brain and there's this bi-directional communication. So Neuro Immunology is again this really cool new research that studies the interaction of the immune system and our nervous system and the brain. Because until recently, it was kind of thought that the brain and the immune system, did their own thing. They weren't really studied together. And so we know that independently, the brain is very complex and the immune system is very complex. But again, much like siblings kind of have this connection that not everybody can understand. They kind of just, they vibe together. This is what happens with the immune system and the brain, which is why it's equally important to pay attention to both of them. However, our mind is going to be really, really important. You might know people in your life who are worrywarts or hypochondrias that every time they think a thought, they get sick. They worry themselves into sickness, right? I'm worried sick. People say that all the time. So we have to learn that these psychological experiences like stress can directly affect our vulnerability to illness, and neuroimmunology can basically look at this process and how we can increase our resistance over time to this, why managing our thoughts matters, why what we say to ourselves matters, why getting rid of pro-inflammatory thoughts and pro-inflammatory people really matters. We also know that our immune cells have docking stations for neurotransmitters, which is so cool. So our lymphocytes, which is a part of our white blood cell gang, they have receptors for neurotransmitters. These white blood cells actually produce and respond to neurotransmitters. Some neurotransmitters are immunosuppressive, others can stimulate immunity, and there are certain therapies that are directed at neurotransmitters that could potentially affect the immune system, sometimes a secondary effect of what's going on with people who are on antidepressants. So again, these immune cells called macrophages, they show up at the scene of an infection first. They're the first responders. These macrophages themselves, these immune system cells, actually produce pro-inflammatory molecules, interleukin-1, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor, And these inflammatory molecules can trigger that sickness response, sickness behavior, but also can negatively influence mood. They have found in research of depressed patients higher levels of these inflammatory cytokines. So brain inflammation and depression, there is a correlation and a connection for that. Inflammation in the brain may be associated with depression when the immune system is activated. So they're finding this link between all of that. Now, before everybody gets all worried about, oh my God, I'm stressed, now I'm going to get sick, I always tell people, don't stress about stress. So we know that we have these things called glucocorticoids, these family of steroid hormones produced by our brain and our endocrine system when we're under stress. And we know that they can severely impact our immune response. But we also know that not all stress is created equal. A meta-analysis of 300 studies found that certain types of stress alter different aspects of the immune system. So they looked at different kinds of stress, like brief stress, maybe you're studying for an exam, and then they looked at chronic stress, like you had a major life event, right? Like caring for a partner who had dementia. And what they found was that these brief stressors tended to suppress cellular immunity. So this is what deals with when we're getting invaded by pathogens and viruses. While humoral immunity, which deals with pathogens outside of the cells as well, can be mildly suppressed. Chronic stress suppressed both types of immunity. So brief stress only really took a toll on cellular immunity, while chronic long-term stress suppressed both kinds. So we know that, yes, managing your levels of stress is going to be important for dealing with your immune system, but we also know that in short bursts, stress can actually be really beneficial. Things like working out, going to a sauna, calorie restriction, if done correctly, can all turn on certain processes in the body. So it's really important to understand that not all stress is created equal. It's not all bad. It's not going to, be the end of everything that you have going on in your life, but we do have to have perspective. We do have to understand that the thoughts that we think can directly impact and affect what's going on with our hormones and our immune system, and understand that the brain is the control center. The brain is the manager. The brain is in charge, and your immune system and your hormones are just always secondarily responding. Now, for the last segment of the show, we are going to get into knowledge bites, because knowledge is your brain's favorite food. What's really interesting is that these psychological factors that are under our control, so having supportive friends, having supportive family, finding ways that you can relieve your stress can actually be a coping mechanism for developing what I like to call your emotional immune system. There was a study that was done in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2001, and it was at the University of Toronto. And they found that women who had breast cancer who attended support groups lived longer. So there's definitely good research to talk about having good people in your life. And having good people doesn't always mean necessarily a person. It can be yourself. It can be things that make you feel better. Daily affirmations, cutting out pro-inflammatory, negative self-talk, people that don't serve your highest good. All of that's going to be really important. And so one of your homework assignments that I would love for all of you to have at the end of this episode is, understanding that if you can't change your situation, then you can change your perspective on the situation. As I like to always say, some days you're the pigeon and some days you're the statue. So working on changing the perception about things, understanding that I can only control what I can control, and seeing what areas of your life that you're allowing certain things to stay that shouldn't be staying, that have outrun their time here. That's going to be really important. And a lot of that starts with your mind. The thoughts you think, the things you say to yourself, how you view the cards that you've been dealt, all of that really matters secondarily for the immune system and the endocrine system. So developing your emotional immune system. having a positive outlook, it doesn't mean that you never feel a negative emotion or you never feel sad or you never feel angry. That's not the goal here. When I talk about developing an emotional immune system, I mean developing emotional resilience, emotional stamina. So understanding that all emotions are transient, whether good, bad, and different, and we have to adapt regardless. So finding balance. Emotions are a lot like the weather. They come and go. You can't get mad at Mother Nature because it's raining, but you can bring an umbrella with you. So that's where psychoneuroimmunology can definitely have a role. And there's definitely been research that talks about having fewer negative emotions, and people who had that were able to bounce back from these difficult issues in their life actually developed what we call resilience. So another sign of this emotional wellness is being able to hold on to these positive emotions longer, developing a sense of meaning and purpose in your life. And for all the nerds out there, there's been brain imaging that has looked at those that had positive emotions, right? So whether that means, flipping your perspective on a situation, reframing a thought interruption, right? That can actually trigger reward pathways located deep within the brain. It's part of the brain called the ventral striatum. And these individuals who were able to savor these positive emotions had lasting activation in this part of the reward brain. And this continued activation of this part of the brain had been linked to changes in the body, including lower levels of stress hormones. So being able to hold on to those good times, those good emotions, having positive self-talk with yourself, bouncing back, big hoop energy, as my best friend calls it, because you gotta sometimes just understand that, negative emotions from a scientific standpoint, they can play a role in activating brain regions of the amygdala. And we want to activate the reward centers of the brain. We want to feel good. So understanding that there is a difference in how we can recover from this, bouncing back, resilience, being open to positive changes is really the key to emotional wellness. And, we can definitely have some control over the emotions that we experience, right? We can sometimes prepare ourselves, but sometimes we can't. So having a positive mindset, developing those mental tools that we need, figuring out a list of what's going to make me feel better right now versus what do I need to work on for my long-term mental health. Everything doesn't always require an emotional reaction. Our body's responding to the brain, and understanding that we're all just riding the wave of life. And if we think of these emotions as waves, we have high tide, we have low tide, we have rip tides. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just kind of hang out and see when the next wave is going to come, because eventually everything comes back to shore and kind of comes back to balance, or homeostasis, as they would call it in the scientific world. So make sure that you're being the manager of your body and your brain and your thoughts, and understanding that your immune system and your nervous system and all of that is secondarily responding. And most importantly, do what you feel is best, that makes you happy. And I just think it's easier to be a nice person sometimes. And it doesn't always mean to have rainbows and butterflies every single day, but understanding that if it does rain, there will be a sunny day, and sunshine all the time makes a desert. So we got deep at the end of the podcast today, and I liked it. And I hope you all liked it too. And I look forward to seeing y'all on next week's episode. Ciao. Ba-da-da-da-da-da.